An angry drunk man thought royal guards were just overpaid statues in fancy uniforms. But when he disgraced the sacred uniform with his disgusting act, one swift response from the guard left him regretting every word. You might want to hit subscribe before this guard shows why you never mess with the royal uniform. Now, here's what happened. The sun rose over the historic city, bathing the cobblestone streets in a warm, golden light. Tourists from across the globe had already started to gather near the royal palace, cameras in hand, eager to capture the grandeur of its towering gates. But amidst the murmurs of excitement and the clicking of shutters, one figure stood out. A solitary royal guard, stoic and immovable, the very picture of discipline. He stood tall, his red tunic perfectly pressed, the glint of his ceremonial weapon catching the morning sun. His bearskin hat, towering above his head, was a symbol of tradition that stretched back centuries. Despite the lively crowd, just feet away, his eyes remained fixed forward, unblinking, his expression carved from stone. To the untrained eye, he might seem like a statue, but those who truly understood his role knew better. This was no mere ceremonial post. Behind the stillness lay an iron resolve, forged through years of rigorous training and an unwavering sense of duty. The guard's role was sacred, a blend of symbolism and security, a living embodiment of the nation's history and pride. Every detail of his uniform and every motion he made or didn't make was steeped in meaning. A small boy tugged at his mother's hand, pointing excitedly at the guard. "Why doesn't he move, Mummy?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. The mother smiled, leaning down to whisper, "Because it's his job to stand still. It's a sign of his discipline. He's one of the best soldiers in the country." The boy stared in awe, as if the guard were a superhero from his favourite comic books. But not everyone in the crowd shared the same reverence. A group of teenagers laughed and made faces at the guard, daring one another to see if they could make him flinch. Others simply treated him like a prop, posing for pictures as if he weren't even human. But the guard was used to this. It was part of the job. His stillness wasn't just physical, it was mental. He had mastered the art of tuning out the distractions, of focusing only on his duty. Each second was a test of his resolve, a testament to the tradition he represented. As the morning wore on, the crowd continued to swell. There was a sense of normalcy to the scene, a daily ritual that unfolded with clockwork precision. But somewhere in the crowd, chaos was brewing. A man stumbled through the throng, his clothes dishevelled, his breath reeking of alcohol. He was muttering to himself, his movements unsteady, like a ship being tossed by unseen waves. The royal guard didn't notice him, at least not yet. For now he stood his ground, unaware that his day was about to take a dramatic and humiliating turn. The tourists laughed and chatted, snapping pictures and marvelling at the guard's discipline. But if they had looked a little closer, they might have noticed the storm brewing in the distance, a storm that would test the guard's patience, his composure, and ultimately his strength. At first he was barely noticeable, a shadow moving through the throng, but as he came closer, his presence became impossible to ignore. The drunk man stumbled into view, his clothes rumpled, his hair unkempt, and his face flushed from a long night of drinking. In his hand, he clutched a nearly empty bottle, his fingers gripping it as though it were the last shred of control he had left. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around the crowd with a mix of confusion and disdain. He muttered to himself, his words slurred and incoherent, but the anger in his tone was unmistakable. This wasn't just a man who had been drinking. This was a man who was hurting. Yesterday his life had unravelled. He had been called into his boss's office, expecting a routine meeting, only to be handed a termination letter. 20 years of work, of sweat and sacrifice, reduced to a few sentences on a piece of paper. His job was gone, his bills were piling up, and he had no idea how he would explain any of this to his wife and children. So he had done the only thing he could think of. He drank. He drank to forget, to numb the pain, to push away the overwhelming sense of failure. But now, standing in front of the royal palace, with its pristine gates and immaculate guards, all he felt was rage. The guard standing before him became the embodiment of everything he hated in that moment. The man's stillness, his discipline, his polished uniform, all of it felt like an insult. "Look at him," the drunk man muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Standing there like a damn statue. For what? What's he even doing?" Some of the tourists turned to look at him, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. A few backed away, sensing the tension in his voice. But the drunk man didn't care. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He took a swig from his bottle, the liquid spilling slightly as his hands shook. Then, with a staggered step, he moved closer to the guard. His voice grew louder, his words sharper. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the guard. "Huh? You think standing there all day makes you important?" The guard, as always, didn't react. His eyes remained fixed ahead, his posture unyielding. To the crowd, it was a remarkable display of discipline. To the drunk man, it was infuriating. "Yeah, that's what I thought," the man sneered. "You're nothing, just a puppet in a fancy suit. While people like me, people who actually work, we get fired. We lose everything. And you just stand there doing nothing and get paid twice as much." He stumbled closer, now mere feet away from the guard. The tourists gasped, their phones snapping pictures and recording videos, eager to capture the drama. But the guard remained unmoved, his face a mask of indifference. The drunk man laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "What? You can't even talk, can you? Is that part of your sacred duty, to stand there and pretend like you're better than the rest of us?" The crowd was growing uneasy. Some whispered among themselves, debating whether to step in or call for help, but most simply watched, captivated by the unfolding spectacle. The drunk man waved his bottle in the air, his anger boiling over. "You're a joke, you know that? A goddamn joke!" But even as his words grew harsher, the guard stood firm. He had been trained for moments like this, taught to endure insults and provocation without faltering. Yet there was something in the drunk man's voice, a raw, desperate pain, that made the situation feel different. For now, the guard remained silent, but the tension in the air was palpable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. And as the drunk man took another unsteady step forward, the crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. His footsteps were uneven, his words growing louder. His face was twisted with anger, his resentment bubbling over into a stream of insults. "Look at you!" he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're special because you wear that stupid hat, because you can stand still all day. You're nothing but a statue in a red coat." The guard stood motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his expression betraying not even the slightest flicker of emotion. His discipline was unshakable, a shield against the torrent of abuse. The drunk man leaned in closer, his breath sour with alcohol. "What's the matter?" he taunted. "Cat got your tongue? Or is it part of your big, important job to just stand there like a fool while the rest of us work our asses off?" The crowd was no longer just watching, they were recording. Phones were out, capturing every word, every gesture, every bead of sweat on the drunk man's brow as he continued his tirade. Some onlookers whispered nervously, wondering if the man would take things too far. Others laughed, entertained by the spectacle. But the drunk man wasn't done. He waved his bottle in the air, sloshing what little was left onto the pavement. "You know what really gets me?" he shouted, his voice rising. "I busted my back every day for 20 years, and what do I get? Fired! Tossed out like garbage. But you just stand there, doing nothing, and they pay you more in a week than I make in a month. Where's the justice in that, huh?" A few brave tourists tried to intervene, stepping forward cautiously. "Sir, maybe you should calm down," one said, her voice trembling. But the drunk man turned on her, his face red with fury. "Don't tell me to calm down," he roared. "You don't know what it's like. You don't know what I've been through." The woman backed away, her hands raised in surrender. The drunk man turned his attention back to the guard, who still hadn't moved an inch. "Oh, you're good," the drunk man sneered. "You're really good at this, aren't you? Playing the perfect little soldier. But let me tell you something. You don't deserve this job. You don't deserve the respect people give you. You don't deserve anything." The guard's eyes remained fixed ahead, his hands steady on his weapon, but inside his mind was a storm of emotions. He had heard insults before, endured mockery and ridicule without breaking his composure. But there was something about this man's words, the raw bitterness, the pain behind them, that struck a chord. "Say something," the drunk man shouted, his voice cracking. "Go on, prove me wrong. Tell me why you deserve to stand there while I lose everything." Still, the guard remained silent, his stoic demeanour a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. The drunk man laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Yeah, that's what I thought. You've got nothing. Just a uniform and a paycheck you don't deserve." The crowd was growing restless, their murmurs filling the air like an uneasy tide. Some urged the guard to react, to put the man in his place. Others whispered about calling the authorities, worried about how far the drunk man might go. But for now, the guard stood firm, his silence speaking louder than any words ever could. The drunk man, however, was just getting started. His anger was afire, and the guard's stillness was only fueling the flames. The tension in the air was so thick it seemed to press down on the crowd. The drunk man's tirade showed no signs of slowing. His voice was hoarse now, but his anger burned brighter with each passing second. He staggered even closer to the guard, his unsteady feet mere inches away from the soldier's polished boots. "What are you going to do, huh?" the drunk man slurred, waving his empty bottle in the guard's face. "Nothing, that's what. You're a coward, a glorified mannequin." The tourists watched in stunned silence, their phones capturing every moment. Children clutched their parents' hands, their wide eyes darting between the drunk man and the guard. A few whispered, urging someone to step in, but no one dared to intervene. The scene had taken on a dangerous energy, the kind of tension that made people freeze rather than act. The drunk man sneered, leaning so close that the guard could feel the heat of his breath. "Look at you, all dressed up with nowhere to go. You probably think you're better than me, don't you?" Still, the guard didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed ahead, his jaw set with an almost inhuman resolve. But inside, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The drunk man's words weren't just insults. They were a direct assault on the principles he had sworn to uphold. The crowd was holding its collective breath now, their phones still recording, their voices hushed. Everyone knew that this was the moment, the one where everything could spiral out of control. And then it happened. Mid-sentence, the drunk man froze, his face contorting in discomfort. He stumbled back a step, clutching his stomach as a wave of nausea overtook him. For a moment, it seemed like the spectacle was over, like the man might finally retreat. But instead, he doubled over and began to retch. The crowd gasped in horror as the man spewed his stomach's contents all over the ground and the guard. The vomit splattered across the guard's pristine red tunic, staining it with the sickly evidence of the man's drunkenness. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd, followed by a few stifled laughs from those who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The drunk man straightened up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. For a moment he looked dazed, as though even he couldn't believe what he had just done. But then a twisted grin spread across his face, and he began to laugh, a loud, mocking sound that cut through the stunned silence like a knife. "That's what you deserve," he shouted, pointing at the guard with a shaky hand. "You hear me? That's exactly what you deserve." The guard's face remained impassive, but his body shifted ever so slightly. To the crowd it looked like nothing, just a subtle tightening of his jaw, a minute adjustment of his stance. But for those who understood the discipline of the royal guard, it was a sign that the breaking point had been reached. The drunk man, emboldened by his audience, continued to laugh, his voice echoing against the palace walls. "Go on, do something," he taunted, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of mockery. "I dare you!" But this time the guard wasn't going to let it slide. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his gloved hand to his chest and wiped the vomit from his tunic. His movements were measured, almost ceremonial, as though he were preparing for something far more significant than cleaning his uniform. The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift in the air. The guard's composure, unshaken until now, had finally been tested, and the man before him was about to learn the consequences of crossing the line. The crowd stood in silence, their breaths held, as the royal guard completed his slow, deliberate motion of wiping the vomit from his pristine uniform. His gloved hand moved with precision, but beneath the composed exterior, there was a storm brewing, a tightly controlled energy that now demanded release. The drunk man, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, continued to laugh, his voice echoing mockingly in the quiet courtyard. "What's the matter, soldier boy? Can't take a little puke? That's what happens when you stand around all day doing nothing." The guard finally moved, just a fraction of an inch, a slight lowering of his head. His eyes, which had remained fixed and distant until now, locked onto the drunk man's face. The shift was subtle, but powerful, and the drunk man faltered, his laughter trailing off into an awkward chuckle. "Step back," the guard said, his voice calm yet firm. It was the first time he had spoken, and the weight of his words cut through the air like a blade. The crowd shivered, their phones trembling in their hands as they recorded what was sure to be a moment they'd never forget. The drunk man blinked, momentarily stunned by the command. But then he smirked, his bravado returning in full force. "Oh, you finally decided to talk, huh? Took you long enough. What are you going to do, soldier boy? Arrest me? Go ahead, try it." The guard's hand dropped to his side, his fingers brushing the hilt of his ceremonial sword. He didn't draw it. He didn't need to. His presence alone, now fully focused and deliberate, was more than enough to command attention. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing that something monumental was about to happen. "You've crossed the line," the guard said, his voice steady. "You've insulted the uniform, the duty, and the honor I serve. I've tolerated your words, your mockery, but you will not disrespect this post." The drunk man took a step back, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Oh, big words," he sneered, though his voice lacked the conviction it had moments ago. "What are you going to do? You're not allowed to touch me, remember?" The guard stepped forward, his movements smooth and controlled. The crowd gasped as he closed the distance between them in a single stride, his towering figure casting a shadow over the smaller, slouching man. "I warned you," the guard said, his tone like steel. "And now you will learn." Before the drunk man could react, the guard seized his wrist in an iron grip, twisting it just enough to make the man drop the bottle he had been clutching. The glass shattered against the cobblestones, the sharp sound making the crowd flinch. With a swift, practiced motion, the guard turned the man around and pinned him against the metal gate. The crowd erupted into a mix of gasps and cheers, their phones capturing every angle of the takedown. The drunk man struggled, but the guard's strength and training rendered his attempts futile. "Let me go," the drunk man shouted, his voice panicked now. "You can't do this. You're not supposed to move." The guard leaned in, his voice low but audible enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "You think standing here is easy? You think this uniform is just for show? You don't know the first thing about discipline, respect, or sacrifice, but you're about to find out." The drunk man stopped struggling, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The weight of the guard's words, coupled with the undeniable power in his stance, was starting to sink in. The crowd, previously entertained by the man's antics, now watched in awed silence. The mood had shifted completely. With the drunk man subdued, the guard stepped back, releasing him with a firm shove that left the man stumbling to his knees. The royal guard's posture straightened, his hands returning to his sides as though nothing had happened. He stood tall once more, his composure unshaken. "Authorities will handle you now," the guard said simply, nodding toward the palace security team that was already approaching. The drunk man looked around, his bravado gone, his face pale with realization. As the security team reached the scene, the guard resumed his post, standing as still and resolute as he had before. The crowd began to clap, their earlier hesitation replaced by admiration for the guard's professionalism and restraint. The drunk man was led away, his head hanging low. For the first time all morning, he was silent. The crowd lingered in the aftermath of the spectacle, a hushed reverence settling over the space. The royal guard stood at his post, once again motionless, as though nothing had happened. His uniform, still stained from the earlier incident, seemed to glow with an almost mythical air under the sunlight. To the onlookers, he was more than just a soldier now. He was a symbol of discipline, honor, and resilience. The drunk man, now subdued and slumped, was escorted away by palace security. His earlier bravado had crumbled, leaving behind a hollow shell of shame. As he passed through the crowd, a few people murmured words of disdain, shaking their heads at his disgraceful behavior. Others simply watched in silence, their gazes a mixture of pity and condemnation. "Serves him right," a man in the crowd muttered to his friend, "disrespecting a royal guard like that. He's lucky he wasn't thrown in jail on the spot." "I've never seen anything like it," his friend replied. "The way that guard handled himself, incredible. He didn't even lose his temper." Nearby, a young woman whispered to her child, who clutched her hand tightly. "That's why we respect them," she said softly. "They're not just standing there, they're protecting something bigger than themselves." The child looked up at the guard with wide eyes, the earlier fear replaced by awe. "He's like a superhero," he said in a small voice. The mother smiled and nodded. As the drunk man was led away, his mind raced. The alcohol had begun to wear off, replaced by a growing sense of dread and regret. The guard's words echoed in his ears. "You think this uniform is just for show? You don't know the first thing about discipline, respect, or sacrifice." He had thought the guard was nothing more than a figurehead, a ceremonial statue paid to stand still, but now he realized how wrong he had been. The guard's restraint, his composure under pressure, his ability to handle the situation without losing control, it all pointed to a strength the drunk man could hardly comprehend. Sitting in the back of a police car, the man dropped his head into his hands. His mind drifted back to the job he had lost, the years of hard work he had poured into a career that had ended so abruptly. But now, for the first time, he began to wonder if he had been the problem all along. The thought was uncomfortable, but it lingered, gnawing at him. Back at the gates, the crowd began to disperse, but the air of respect remained. Tourists continued to take pictures, but now their expressions were different. There was a gravity to the way they looked at the guard, a newfound appreciation for what he represented. One by one, a few stepped forward to offer their gratitude. A middle-aged man approached cautiously, his hat in his hands. "Thank you for your service," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You handled that better than anyone else could have." The guard didn't respond. He wasn't permitted to. But there was something in his posture, a subtle shift that suggested he had heard the words. As the day continued, the guard stood silently, his gaze fixed forward. Outwardly, he was the same as he had always been, stoic, disciplined, and unyielding. But inside, his thoughts churned. Moments like these weren't uncommon, though they rarely escalated to such extremes. The guard knew his role was often misunderstood, reduced to a symbol rather than recognized for the sacrifice it entailed. Yet he also knew that this was the very essence of his duty, to embody something greater than himself, to stand as a sentinel of history, tradition, and respect. He thought about the drunk man, about the pain behind his words and actions. The guard didn't hate him, he pitied him. He understood that the man's anger wasn't truly directed at him, but at a life that had felt unfair, unkind. Still, the guard couldn't let the incident slide. There were lines that couldn't be crossed, and part of his duty was to ensure that respect for the post was upheld. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courtyard, the guard remained at his post. The stain on his uniform was a reminder of the day's events, but he wore it with pride. It wasn't a mark of disgrace, it was a testament to his resolve. The drunk man, sitting alone in a holding cell, stared at the floor, his head heavy with regret. He would have time to reflect on his actions, to think about the man he had mocked and the lessons he had learned. Perhaps he thought it wasn't too late to change. Respect is earned, not demanded, and discipline is the foundation upon which respect is built. For those who stand unwavering in the face of mockery, their strength lies not in their silence, but in their resolve to protect something greater than themselves. Want more incredible stories of Royal Guard's resilience? Hit that subscribe button right now and join our growing community of Royal Guard enthusiasts. Don't forget to smash that like button if you enjoyed this story, and hit the bell icon to be notified whenever we upload new Royal Guard encounters. Check out our other videos showcasing the unwavering discipline of Royal Guards worldwide. New stories every week. Thank you for watching, and remember, true strength stands the test of time.